Bom dia a todos. Estamos aqui hoje reunidos para este evento sobre The New Leadership Competencies of the Digital World. Como podem verificar, o Diogo infelizmente não teve a possibilidade de se juntar a nós e pediu-me para o representar aqui hoje e transmitir algumas mensagens relacionadas com o trabalho que a APDC tem feito nesta matéria de discussão à volta de novos talentos, new leadership para a sociedade nacional, para Portugal, mas também em termos europeus. Nesse sentido, a APDC tem procurado em vários fóruns, tem procurado discutir e promover o debate e trazer informação e meios de discussão sobre a geração de valor e a geração de líderes em Portugal. Hoje é um evento importante para nós porque é uma forma de termos vários responsáveis de empresas que podem analisar e pensar um pouco o que é que são os desafios na seleção de novos líderes e novos talentos. A nível do Congresso, a APDC já procurou nos últimos 2 congressos de comunicações que fossem discutidos estes temas dos novos talentos. Nós tivemos, se recordarem, inclusive foi desenvolvido um trabalho sobre Next Generation Talents, no qual se procurou que 150 estudantes das 25 mais prestigiadas universidades nacionais tivessem presentes e, portanto, gerar desta forma uma bolsa à volta do valor e dos talentos em Portugal. E temos promovido também, também no âmbito do Congresso, uma sessão chamada Challenge of Next Generation Careers, também com o mesmo objetivo. E para nós, o setor dos TIC New Media, sem dúvida, porque é olhado com algum cuidado e com alguma atenção, por ser um setor que é driver, tem-se procurado, temos que nós ter uma certa responsabilidade e peso neste desenvolvimento de ideias e nesta procura de novos talentos. E é por isso hoje que também estamos aqui reunidos e que promovemos este evento. Nós vamos ter, e agora vou-me permitir, vou mudar para inglês, we'll have Andrew Gilchrist, que é, which is partner of Egon Zehnder International, and is going to make a presentation on the theme of the new leadership competencies of the digital world. We'll have also the participation of 2 leaders of the 2 major ICT companies in Portugal, João Picoito, Head of Southern Europe at Nokia Siemens Networks, and José Carlos Gonçalves, CEO of Logica. And we'll also count on the collaboration of Paulo Simões, Commissioner of APDC for Talent, to moderate this participation. With no further delay, I'll start this executive breakfast, and I pass the floor to Andrew Gilchrist. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Andrew Gilchrist from the London office of Egon Zehnder. And I come here in a suit, but have been working in the sort of digital environment for some time. And the first thing that I used to do when I used to approach the very, very small offices in Google in London, which were behind the corner just off Soho Square, in those early days, is to take off my tie. Because there was no way you could go to the digital people there wearing a tie. You would look absolutely like a suit, and you had to start behaving slightly differently. So there's no great skill in taking off the tie, but there's something about behavior, and that is a theme that I want to come back to a little bit later on as we go through that. I've got to get my mind into the digital time now as well, because I've just been spending some very interesting time at the table, and I'm going to pronounce this incorrectly, talking about General Gondestavo, the 14th century general who performed this extraordinary battle against your neighbors. So I'm still a little bit fuzzy in my mind about that and that time, so we've got to bring ourselves right up to today. So I just want to ask, most of you recognize this. How many of you in this room have one of these? How many? So around about, actually no more than about a tentative half. How many of you use it every single day as much as you thought you were going to? That's not bad. I think some of you are probably fibbing, but it's not bad that quite a few use it quite a lot. It's a triumph in one way. Let's talk about this shape for a moment. So I want to talk for a moment about the development of the tablet. But I'm going to go right back much further than your general in the 14th century to this tablet here. This is the Rosetta Stone, 3 different languages written on that stone, but essentially it's a tablet. Now what's interesting is this shape is a shape which, right since then, has been one which has been recognized as the easiest way for us to absorb information, and it's no surprise that that is still today the shape. Now things took a while to develop. I was in the Financial Times before joining Egon Zehnder, and I was responsible for starting the electronic side of what the FT did. And what's interesting is that in 1997, I went to Boulder, Colorado, where a local newspaper group there, Gannett, were looking at trying to produce a newspaper in a tablet form. And they had that already in 1997. So what's interesting is that although only last year did our familiar iPad come out, the shape and the concept was already there, and it had been there for some time. So not everything happens in the digital world incredibly quickly. Now, admittedly, the time from 190 BC to 1997 is a long time, but essentially the reason why this couldn't be realized until about 2010 was largely to do with some really small things like battery power and wireless. But the idea, the concept was already there. But then things do speed up because this year, within a year of the first iPad coming out, the second one's come out a couple of days ago with the re-emergence of Steve Jobs as well. So there is speed involved in what we're dealing with, and I want to talk a little bit about just what we're all dealing with in terms of and why digital is such a fascinating time. How many of you remember or recognize that statement? Or who said it? What I would do, I'd shut down that company and give the money back to its shareholders. Do people know who that was? That was Michael Dell talking about Apple in 1997. At that time, Dell's share price, $33, Apple, around about $17. Let's bring it up to today. $15 for Dell, $352 yesterday for Apple. So he slightly has to eat his words. So it's not just about doing things quicker, because in fact Dell were doing things quicker and quicker and quicker. It's about working faster as well, and more smartly. And that's actually what's happened. What's actually interesting, the difference between Dell there and Apple. What's interesting is that Apple make nearly all their money on their hardware, which is what Dell's been doing as well. It's hardware. Apple make almost no money on iTunes. It's all to do with what they make on their hardware. So there is things about fast and working smarter in the digital environment. There's also extremely fast. This is just a graph which, for those of you in the telco world, will probably recognize. Early on in the mobile phones, when there's access to the internet, you tried to grab the consumers in a walled garden in an experience actually owned by the telco operators. Within a year, the proportion of people who spent time on the telco's walled garden on the mobile phone collapsed, and it's now one of the lowest market shares of all. So there are some incredibly quick things happening in the digital environment as well, over which you as an individual operator may not necessarily have control. And also, what might be very important for one set of people is not necessarily important for others. Google just decided to start announcing that they were going to have free turn-by-turn navigation. It's not absolutely core to them. They could easily produce that. As soon as they did that, this happened to 2 large navigation companies. Their prices collapsed as a result of something which wasn't really directly relevant to Google on the side, but made an enormous difference. So there are lots of colliding different types of dynamics going on at the moment within the industry that we're all familiar with, and I'm afraid some of you will be up on here. And what's happening is there are people who were doing well, who've since then died slightly. There are organizations which more recently have come up and have become sustained. And really, it's a different map than one a while ago, but there are winners and losers in this. So are there lessons that one can be drawn about what it is to be sustainably successful in this sort of emerging environment where an awful lot of the rules are being broken? And in a way, one could think about, are there a whole series of new skills which allow somebody, as indeed our headline at the beginning has suggested, make us successful in this new environment? And my contention a little bit is going to be there are not quite as many new skills as you might think, or they're certainly not quite as hard as you might think. Just for a moment, I want to go back. Between 1970 and 2010, if you look at companies which demonstrated the greatest degree of sustained growth, any idea which one of the companies over that long period might have been the most successful one? People come up with ideas like IBM, GE. I mean, interestingly enough, the most successful, sustained growth over that time is Southwest Airlines. Now, Jim Collins, who's done an awful lot of work in his book, Good to Great, to understand what it takes for sustained success over that period of time, eventually, through a lot of analysis, was able to demonstrate that actually, in terms of what really, really made a difference to companies which did very, very well, part of it was to do with the environment in terms of the industry effect, the company effect, and when they started. But by far the largest individual driver for sustained success was leadership. And that's exactly the same in the digital world as it was in that broader set of quotas which Jim Collins looked at. He, as some of you will know, has famously said, put the right people on the bus, get the wrong people off the bus, put them on the right seats, and then figure out where to go. So let's just think about that for a moment, about what is it that identifies the right sort of people? How do you pick them? Well, one thing we at Egon Zehnder have found is that if you look at the different ways you can identify potential drivers for success, and we put 3 here which are often used, looking at people's experience, looking at how intelligent their IQ, and what we'll call soft skills, behavioral skills for a moment. And we then plotted those against, in our database, a lot of individuals who had, through their years and their careers, enjoyed success and failure. The following came out: that people who potentially had exactly the right experience to do a job particularly well, in fact, were just as likely to be correlated with failure as it is with success. And the same is basically the case of IQ. There's no necessary positive correlation between high IQ and success. Interestingly enough, if you looked at all the people who excelled in lots of behavioral issues of soft skills, did well in those, there was a very, very high positive correlation between having successful careers over a sustained period of time. That's a very, very important pointer for us. So let's just explore this in a little bit more detail. I think I was asked to explain a little bit about how Apple and Google do their recruiting. And they've been extremely clear about the way they've gone about their own recruiting, at least when they started. The most important thing for them is to get the smartest people they possibly can do. And so, yes, that is to do with IQ. And they are completely uncompromising about always going after the cleverest people they can find. And I'll explain that in a little bit more detail in a minute. They also, though, and this starts going on to some of the behavioral side, try and work out how they can identify people who are going to identify with their core values. And by the way, those core values between Apple and Google are different. Surprisingly, by the way, if you talk to their senior executives, neither of them articulate anything about wanting to make money, which is rather odd. They're always talking about doing good and producing great stuff. They never actually talk about making money, which is interesting. Very, very importantly, though, and this is a really, really key criteria when they actually look at people to start with who might want to come in, is they are really keen on responsibilities rather than job titles. When we prep sometimes individuals who might be having interviews with Google or indeed Apple, the worst thing you can do is start asking about how big will my span of control be, what my title be, that sort of thing. That sort of thing is an anathema to organizations like Apple and particularly Google, where they believe that you are largely as good as what you're doing. Responsibilities change shape. You're part of project teams which morph and change as well. So being fixated about titles is entirely wrong. And it's a really, really important cultural point. And then, of course, passion. And about the company and what they're trying to do. And that is real for both these two organizations. Now, what's interesting is that if these might be seen in some ways as organizations which have been leading the way in large corporate terms for digital expertise, it's been quite interesting for us observing, having worked with both these organizations for quite a period of time now, about whether actually the way they've gone about their recruiting and what they've identified as digital expertise has worked. Now, clearly, nobody can argue with the success of Google and the success of Apple. But they also themselves, to a certain extent, are trying to make sure they reinvent themselves properly when it comes to thinking about what it takes to have the right sort of skill set to succeed. And in particular, what's happened is Google have actually changed their way of doing their recruiting. What used to be the case is they used to have an endless amount of interviews, probably around about sort of 20-plus interviews. And they were incredibly heavily weighted towards intellectual case-type sort of discussions. And they were far, far too preoccupied in some ways about just straightforward IQ. Google's view of the world is you can wrestle almost any problem to the ground via an algorithm, and that informs a lot of the way they work. As a result of that, they were very, very dependent upon people who were just incredibly clever. But they realized, to a certain extent, actually, that huge, great big interview process was becoming a slight disincentive, a barrier to people wanting to join. So they reduced it down now to 5 as an absolute maximum. But much, much more importantly, they are beginning to shift to start looking for people who have experience. Experience used to be something they didn't really look into at all. So they really are now beginning to look for people who actually can bring some industry experience. And part of the reason for that is they've become so large as an organization now that you actually have the problem of quite young, in inverted commas, individuals being partners with other members of media, of government, of other sectors of industry, who are a good 10, 15 years their elder, with a lot more experience about how to negotiate, how to form partnerships. And so Google realized that one of their great challenges of growth is they haven't got enough people with enough experience or gravitas. So they are specifically asking us now to find people who bring some of that, which is quite a change for Google. Again, fun enough, that's got nothing in itself to do with digital. They're also very interested, though, in identifying entrepreneurs, because they believe that whilst they have a clear idea about what they want to do, they want to bring people in who are constantly interested in change and new challenges. And as I said, they need people who actually can lead that growth. So that is actually a change in the way that Google are recruiting. And right now, to be quite specific about it, I've got to try and find somebody to run YouTube across EMEA. YouTube will be an extraordinary phenomenon over the next few years. They have in their sights the whole of the global TV advertising budget, which they think a lot of that eventually will come into the hands of something like YouTube. And it's quite interesting observing, having been involved in the recruitment of a person, he's called Nikesh Arora, who used to run Google in Europe and now basically responsible for the commercial side of Google globally, and reflecting on the difference between what they were looking for then as Google and what YouTube are looking for now. What they've asked us for this time is they want somebody with industry experience. They're being more prescriptive about it, somebody who probably does come from the sort of cable, television, digital platforms. But the really interesting thing is, the thing they're looking for is somebody with sophisticated leadership, with enabling powers to actually allow people within that organization to flourish. And these are sort of words which actually weren't quite so relevant a while ago. So that is what's happening even amongst these players, they are, in some ways, moving towards what many of you in this audience would have been very familiar with anyway, if you like, in some ways, slightly traditional behaviors in terms of leadership as opposed to just raw intellectual power. So, what are these digital competencies? And that's the thing I wanted to talk about for a couple of minutes. I think what I'd like to suggest that these elusive new leadership digital competencies are actually only 20% actually new skills. And there's a big other 80% I'll come back to in a minute. But let's look for a moment on that 20%. The first one is technical literacy. I mean, clearly, without any doubt, there is a level of understanding what's going on in the new economy which everybody has to get familiar with. And without it, it is very, very difficult to have conversations, to engage, to understand some of the opportunities. And I think particularly difficult then to anticipate some of the threats. So that is important. Interesting enough, if you look at an organization today, let's call this an organization for a moment, you can think of three different groups. Those people who are joining any of our organizations today, any of our organizations, not Google necessarily, not Apple, but any of our organizations, they have a natural level of digital literacy. They've probably done most of their exams at university on the computer. They've probably cheated by using the internet. I mean, it's all sorts of things like that, which is just absolutely second nature to them. And then you have another group, maybe some of us, me certainly, in this room, where we're being educated by our children. We're not internet children ourselves, but how many of us can think of a time when you're sitting at home with your children, watching a movie together, and irritatingly, they are also on their mobile phone texting at the same time. I mean, that for me is a normal phenomenon now, but at least we're seeing it, we're observing it. Actually, what we're observing is their ability to multitask, do lots of different sort of channels at the same time. It might to us appear rather strange, but to them it's completely natural. So for them it's natural, and fun enough, those of us who have children doing that are, in a proxy sort of way, becoming quite familiar with what's going on the internet. But strangely, in many organizations, there is a digital gap. There are the people in the middle of the organization who aren't quite so the real graduates of the internet in some ways, the digital time, nor do they yet have irritating children who are telling them all the time about the latest trend and the latest game and the latest mobile op. And that's actually, I think, quite a challenge for organizations. And so that then, inasmuch as we said that 20% of what has to be done is actually hard skill acquisition, is how do you fill that digital gap? I don't think there are a huge amount of people out there who are all digital savvy, all of whom are just desperate to come into this sort of organization like this. So the answer for this, given that the real prize is to make the whole organization digitally literate, is a mixture between some people being brought in, but actually a lot of education internally as well. And that's really, really key. You can't rely on just one or two digital gurus. You've got to make the whole organization much, much more digital-centric, digitally aware. And that can be done in all sorts of different ways, but actually, for those of you in leadership positions, I do think that's something which actually requires real effort, and you can't just rely on it happening organically. The second thing behind technical literacy is analytical dexterity. And I really do think here is a significant shift. And if I can just give one example for a moment. The substitution between traditional advertising and online advertising is quite phenomenal. And it is a traditional substitution curve where it's accelerating incredibly quickly. But what does that really mean? I mean, you look, some of the spend now on internet ad revenue is going to be absolutely phenomenal. The implication behind that is that whereas in the old days, if you think about advertising, I think that famous rule was you knew that 50% of what you were paying for, you understood, the other 50% you didn't know. You had focus groups, you had to hope that in fact it was going to hit the right audience. The huge difference with any form of digital engagement, let's call it digital advertising for a moment, is that you get this phenomenal analytical amount of data which you can actually do something with. You know exactly to whom you're sending it, and you get responses back. So I think two of the most important shifts which are happening, enabled by the digital economy, is that the huge shift actually is the power from the organizations, whether they're broadcasters, big companies, producers, sellers, to the consumers. The consumers in all sorts of different ways, or the purchasers in all sorts of ways, are having much of the power transferring to them. Whether it's the transparency of processes, the fact that they can decide when to buy and how to buy, they can research, they can compare, an enormous amount of power is going to consumers. But interesting enough, in just the same ways you've got that dynamic going that direction, precisely because those individuals can now go on the internet or engage in some way digitally and investigate, look, you as the producers in some ways can see what they're doing. So in the opposite direction is a huge amount of information flowing back towards people. And the key is how you then use that information. So every time somebody goes on the internet, makes a purchasing decision, browses, looks at different things, all that can be tracked. And particularly, of course, importantly, if you can do it on a mobile phone, where you know where they are, when they are, what they're doing. That is a phenomenal amount of information, and all that is coming back. But it's information, and it's all data. So we believe that one of the most important changes in terms of hard skills, and one of the most important skills which organizations, no matter where they are in the value chain, is to get marketeers who are much, much more analytically able. And in fact, make many people in the organization just much, much more analytically literate. Typically, marketeers tend to come from an arts background. And many of the people who are CMOs and so on, they tend to come from the humanities. So what's happened is you have people like that who are often now in charge, obviously very good, very creative and so on, and yet the data with which they're having to manage their business has changed fundamentally from being a creative ad agency, sort of nice ideas, to a huge, this hose pipe of rich data coming. So there is a real premium on marketeers in general who are analytically extremely able, because that is the exact way you're going to get competitive advantage. That is a hard skill, which is definitely coming. And I can think of quite a few clients we've got at the moment who are asking us to find people who are extraordinarily analytically able. The challenge we have, and this thing comes back to those soft skills I was talking about, is that most of us in the room probably can think of highly analytical people. How many of those are good at leading as well? And that is a real challenge. So that's on the hard skills side. But actually, what I want to talk about for a moment is the soft skills side. Because our premise, in a way, is that although we talk about sort of digital skills, what I think we're mainly interested in is how we can operate well within this changing digital environment. And our contention would be that a lot of that is to do with the behavioral soft skills we were talking about, those criteria for success earlier on, rather than just necessarily hard skills. It might sound a bit fluffy, but let me just give you a couple of examples of this. Customer centricity. I've already talked about just how important that information flow is and understanding that. It makes an enormous difference, because nowadays, you really do have the ability to understand customers in the most extraordinary amount of detail, because they are demonstrating their behavior, their preferences, their likes, where they are all the time. And organizations that can take advantage of that, monetize that, will achieve lasting advantage. But it works in lots of different ways. So for instance, let's think of an organization which is hardly very digital, Lego, that famous toy builder. They produced a website, digital design website, which allows a lot of people who like Lego to go onto the site and actually build new models. And by now, they've got 77,000 new models with all the design things written out which can be bought, all designed by their own customers. So they've actually sort of outsourced in some ways many of the new ways of coming up with new Lego toys. And that's all part of this Web 2.0, where again, you're really allowing that huge, sort of very often goodwill group of people out there individually to try and make some contribution. So they're listening to their customers in a profoundly different way. Simon Clift, who until recently was the CMO of Unilever, has really got onto this as well. And he now, before he left Unilever, was using many people who are just consumers of different products within Unilever to help them think about new advertising campaigns and bring them back into Unilever. So just absolutely, he could do that because of the distributed power of the internet. So if I think about customer centricity as being really important, but equally, what I'm calling it perpetual change. Now, people talk about this all the time, and we've heard about it, but it really, really is important. But the idea behind it is that things move so quickly that you've just got to be entirely alive, often through customer centricity, to how things are changing. And again, an example. A film was made some time ago called Snakes on Planes, that ghastly film. Do you remember where there's them snakes on planes? Now, after the filmmakers had made that film, before they actually sort of showed it, they started doing some pre-marketing, some pre-distribution, and they distributed some bits of it onto the internet. Very, very quickly what happened was that people picked up on this, and fan clubs started on the internet just from these little snippets. And very quickly from that, organically, video games started developing, or different ways of using this ghastly concept of snakes on planes. Those filmmakers were so alive to what was happening, they noticed, actually, that they could see from the way the fan clubs were talking about it, that some of the things in the film which they'd made and had finished, put in the can, were wrong, or weren't going to allow them to take enough advantage of some of the video games which might develop. So they went back, and they refilmed some days of Snakes on Planes. Then they distributed it, and hey presto, it was, for those people who want to watch that sort of thing, a huge success with a knock-on effect to the games. And that's a really, really good example of actually using the internet when you think actually normally a film is a film is a film, it's finished. Constant change. Collaboration and connecting. This is one of the most important points of all. One of the features of the digital environment is essentially it breaks down traditional silos. It really, really forces you to think very, very differently about how you can create money. Whether, for instance, earlier on I demonstrated that Google, through something on their side, could really, really have a negative impact on a different organization. Equally, inside organizations, you've got to think about collaboration. You've got to think about the impact much, much earlier on in product design for marketing and eventual distribution, for example. And let me, again, give a small example. Telco this time. Cell C, some of you may know, is the third and by far the smallest of the three telco operators in South Africa. We have the two big ones, Vodacom and MTN. Cell C last year discovered that they actually have ownership of a 900 bandwidth network, which allows them to very quickly go onto 3G in a way which the other two couldn't necessarily compete with. But how could they completely change the way that the South Africans, who are used to Cell C being a very, very poor provider, how could they change that whole positioning? What they did, they formed a group across the company. Of course, most of that was going to be a sort of a sales and marketing type sort of challenge to get right. But actually, it was somebody much, much earlier in the product design and strategy area who came up with the idea. And the idea was the following. And I really recommend to those of you who want to look at this later on, there's a very, very funny stand-up comedian in South Africa called Trevor Noah. He's very well known for making fun of most institutions. Very well known in South Africa. One day, Trevor Noah stood up on stage and did a brilliant, what's called rant, making fun of all the telco operators. It was very, very funny. And it was filmed. And it was filmed and went onto YouTube. And he was incredibly rude about Cell C. And this started developing a sort of viral marketing network type sort of, all by itself within South Africa, but it was so funny and really quite rude about the telco operators. And a lot of people started sort of watching this. Have you seen this? Because it is so funny. After a while, because it's got quite a reputation, to everybody's surprise, there was an advertisement, a completely normal television advertisement on the television, and it was about Cell C. And the very first thing that happened is Trevor Noah, the person who had been, that person being so rude about Cell C, had been appointed CEO, Chief Experience Officer, as it turns out. And what he said was, I was so rude about Cell C, they got hold of me and said, look, we've changed, you come and check everything. Watch us like a hawk. And it became Watch us like a hawk. It was a very, very funny set of advertisements. And it achieved the highest level of awareness in South Africa for the last 3 years. It was a brilliant campaign. Now, behind the scenes, it was the idea of somebody in strategy and product development who who'd thought, why don't we script something for Trevor Noah? We're going to script him something for his stand-up routine. So the whole thing was arranged. So it wasn't Trevor Noah doing it by himself and then Celsey taking advantage of it. The whole thing had been thought through in advance by Celsey. They scripted everything about themselves being terrible. Trevor Noah had the whole thing to stand up and say. It viral marketed by itself, and it kickstarted this huge campaign. And that wasn't from somebody who was in advertising or from somebody in sales. That was from somebody much, much earlier in the process. So there was real collaboration again, which came up with that solution. And then lastly here, tester learning agility. Capital One, I think some of you might know as an organization. Capital One is a very successful credit card company. The reason they were so successful is they identified that whereas many people would look at a certain area saying there is risk here because these are bad debt people, maybe they'd sort of once just defaulted, Capital One realized that by really, really clever analytics and testing their hypothesis the whole time, they could sub-segment people into much smaller groups and find there was a whole set of people there who for one reason might have defaulted but were desperate never to default again and therefore were very, very low-risk people once you really identified who they were. So Capital One constantly hired very, very bright people who were very analytical and then whose idea was to constantly test. Test, test, test. And it didn't matter if sometimes they got things wrong. And that's the same as happens time and time again now in the digital environment, because you can do it. The entry barriers are very low to testing. So the whole idea of actually allowing people to think about that beta is fine and a good mistake is not a failure. Test, test, test the whole time. Give me an example very quickly, is if you launch a new sort of idea on the website and you might, for instance, put two colors behind it, red and blue, you can within a day or two see straight away which one has the higher response rate and you can get rid of the other one. So this sort of testing which makes a huge difference, and that culture is a very, very important aspect of new behavior. Just to sort of go quickly through this, I'm afraid I'm a consultant, but I don't for a moment want to pretend I understand this slide. A colleague of mine gave it to me. But what is important here is that once we've been talking about these new digital animals and so on, think also inside your organizations. Think about where some of that skill set should be. And in particular, for instance, the CIO. The point really here is the CIO traditionally used to be back office. But as we're talking about all these digital challenges which are beginning to hit many of the organizations, it's exactly this sort of individual who needs to be brought much, much more, first of all, to engage with all the colleagues internally about how you can be digitally enabled, but then also with the outside world as well. The point behind this is purely that with that evolution, the sort of typical skills which a CIO might have in the past looked at having functional expertise and so on, is evolving, and some of these, let's call them softer skills again, change leadership, strategic orientation, customer focus, are very, very important. And we at Egon Zehnder try and identify these different skills, which are sometimes difficult to pin down. And what we do is we scale them. We've got really quite a, hopefully, sophisticated view about how to sort of put an X on many of these softer skills. And we can rank people depending on how good they may be against some of those. And the point with that CIO one is that whereas in the past that blue line is probably where they would have to have been, in the future they're going to have to get much, much better at some of those things I was talking about earlier on. So it's not just digital natives, new young sort of individuals who are digitally aware. It's also people deep inside your organization who also need to become digitally much more adept. But a lot of that actually is to do with the softer skills. So just to finish, it sounds almost like I've come up with some rules there about what you need to be good at. But actually those rules get broken all the time. And just to very much finish, I want to go right back to the very beginning. You remember that Rosetta Stone I talked about? The real story behind recruiting Nikesh Arora, who now runs Google commercially, is I was sitting in my office knowing I had the responsibility to find somebody to run Google. And the phone rang, and I was told that Larry and Sergey, the two founders, were on a plane coming across. They decided to divert their plane from Italy and were coming to London. And they wanted to see the two final candidates. I wasn't entirely sure who the two final candidates were at that point, so that was a slight problem. The next thing they said was they're coming the next day. And the next thing they said is they do not want to meet at the Google offices, and they don't want to meet at the Egon Zehnder offices. So I had from about 3 o'clock in the afternoon to come up somewhere. They said, think of somewhere crazy, think of somewhere clever. So I tried to think of somewhere for them to meet. And the last thing they said, and by the way, Sergey is bringing about 20 members of his family as well who need to be entertained. So what I did was I actually asked the 2 final candidates, did they have any ideas? Because it's best to sort of, outsource the problem. And as it turned out, the candidate who didn't eventually get the job came up with a brilliant idea of the British Museum. And it really did solve everything. And so I then rang up the director of the British Museum and said, just think Google Wing, Google Wing. And so they thought, OK, Google Wing. And I said, would you mind if I produce 2, frankly, boys? They'll be wearing trainers. They're about so tall. And they will look completely insignificant. But just think Google Wing, because they will be amongst the richest people in the world in a few years' time. So his ears picked up a little bit. And I then persuaded him to get some of his private experts in the field of the British Museum to be on hand so they could scoop up Larry's family and take them on some great tour around the British Museum. And in the meantime, Larry and Sergey interviewed the 2 finalist candidates walking up and down the reading room in the British Library, and they stopped in front of the Rosetta Stone, which is in the reading room of the British Library, or the facsimile of it. And they asked their questions standing in front of something which in some ways is both a tablet and lots of different languages. And it was an extraordinary loop. So it was a long, long way from 30 interviews, doing everything in the way they should do, and that's how they actually hired eventually Nikesh, on the basis of walking up and down the corridors a couple of times. So no matter what we come up with in terms of rules, they will be broken by people who feel they can. So thank you very much indeed for this morning, and I believe we're now going to have some questions.